A lot of people believe we are in a transitional moment in history. And for a lot of people, that means we're heading into a crisis or potentially already are in a crisis of some sort. And I don't know what that crisis could look like. I don't know if it could be fast or slow. But I do believe that if we are going to navigate to a better place on the other side of any kind of crisis, we are going to need paradigm shifts in all three realms: economics, governance, and knowledge systems. And of course, that's why I call this channel The New Enlightenment. It's an analogy with the Old Enlightenment, where there were paradigm shifts in all three realms. In which case, one question is, what is the nature of the paradigm shift in the knowledge realm? And that's the question I'm going to try to answer in this video. We're in a new enlightenment where we need some extra principles that build on top of the principles of the old enlightenment. So we're certainly not getting rid of the scientific method. We need all of that. We need things from the age of reason. We need the scientific method. But in the current system, with all of its chaos, we're going to need some extra things built on top of that that will help better see reality. So in this video, I want to talk about 5 areas of the paradigm shift, where the first relates to groupthink and the way entire networks kind of develop their own biases that are mutually reinforced and whatnot. And then second, of course, I want to talk about the relationship of power to knowledge, where all systems of generating knowledge can be bent, maybe not perfectly, but at least slightly, in the direction that favors power, and how that can get magnified as it compounds over time. And then third, there's this notion that knowledge is different where it's atomized and isolated from its environment, which of course the scientific method is great at doing. It's sort of isolating this one little cause. Knowledge can be really different when it's contextualized in an environment of some sort. And this is the sort of forest versus the trees analogy, where the forest is not just a collection of trees, it's a whole ecosystem. So there's that. And then I want to talk about salience and how any one given piece of information or any one given fact, there are ways of integrating that fact into a worldview that is wrong or that is completely misleading and not a good depiction of reality. But when you try to ask the question, how do you integrate a bunch of different types of knowledge that have been validated scientifically? How do you actually integrate that into a functional and effective worldview? It's not necessarily an easy problem. And then finally, we have to talk about the way the digital environment and algorithms and artificial intelligence works with information, works with knowledge in ways that can either distort that knowledge or bring out the accuracies of that knowledge, and how knowledge systems that are digital in nature could bend reality or bend our perception of reality off course or on course. And we need to be thinking about how to do that. And the last bit I'll talk about for this video has to do with the notion that the people perceiving reality or seeking reality, they have their own hopes and desires. They have sometimes an impetus to try to prove one side right or prove one side wrong. And that desire to prove their side right, that's so powerful, it can distort their perception of reality or the way they weigh evidence one way or another. So given that both the human brain and also the communities that brain are embedded within, those are the instruments through which we perceive reality. How do we get around the biases and the hopes and dreams and the fact that impetus and desire of those communities and of those people will shape entire groups' perception of reality? How do we do that? Especially when sometimes really important issues have groups at loggerheads. The first thing we want to think about is groupthink. And when you get a group of people together to each share their opinions, it is not true that they come to an opinion that's the average of the members of the group. In fact, more often they all move toward the extreme rather than the average if you have some kind of spectrum of their perspectives. So why is that? And it's because you have to acknowledge there is a social element to the exchange of information. And if you have people in the group who have stronger opinions or who are looking for validation, people naturally tend to validate people they like. They tend to sort of reinforce views. If they're looking for, I think I believe this, will anyone tell me I'm smart and sort of let me feel more okay in believing this? So this social dynamic will deeply influence the way a group of people moves in their perception of reality. And of course, this is something that's true even in scientific communities. And that's why you have that quote that scientific knowledge progresses one funeral at a time. The reason for that is because the thought leaders in a field are not going to allow people to gain status or gain attention in their field if those people go against the ideas of the thought leaders. So if there's genuine knowledge that people in the community have started to develop that opposes thought leaders, you kind of have to wait till those thought leaders leave the field or die or have a funeral or whatever before those ideas can actually bubble up and take hold in the community. And of course, this relates to the paradigm shifts that Thomas Kuhn talks about in his book. I have a video on that, which I'll link to below. And one kind of imperfect way of thinking about the difference between the knowledge shift of the Old Enlightenment with the scientific revolution and the knowledge paradigm shift we have going on right now is that the old paradigm shift was a little more focused on the individual. Like, how do you get around the biases of a single individual? And of course, they had great techniques for doing that. Like, the scientific method was a really powerful technique that will need to continue forward into the future. Like, that will need to be strengthened and validated and all that in the new Enlightenment. But the new paradigm shift is less individualistic and more system-based. And I actually think it's important that it's not a shift from individual to group think. It's a shift from an individual approach to a systems approach. And I'm actually not going to fully explain the difference between system and group, but I think some of the people who are not thinking about this correctly are using the concept of group in a way that's not helpful. It's system, where systems have different roles, different relationships, and in designing a system for knowledge spaces, we actually do need to take into account that there are social dynamics and social realities within communities. And we need to design systems that will counteract the biases that are natural as part of any human social community. And part of the reason this is so important is because knowledge is not contained inside any individual human brain. Knowledge is contained in networks of humans that cannot possibly know everything there is to know. So what they can know is whose knowledge do you tap into? Like, what connections for knowledge do you trust to tap into when you need that knowledge? And that means that how you build your trust networks, how you decide who you trust to tap into a body of knowledge, is going to matter a lot. So human social communities, biases in human social communities, that's a big part of this story. Now, the next part of this story relates to knowledge and power, and the fact that power can bend knowledge systems toward its own will to accomplish its own goals. And obviously, lots of people are aware of the fact that funding can bend academic communities, like whoever can fund an institute or whoever can fund grant research or whatnot. Those people have a lot of power in deciding what kinds of research is okay and not okay, what kinds of research gets status or doesn't get status. And the same is true, of course, of journalistic communities, like what kinds of journalism will get funded will determine where that body of knowledge goes. And even if there's only a 1% ability to bend knowledge toward power, that compounds over time. Now, one thing that I think happens in some of these dialogues is that people will get upset because there are groups of people who say knowledge bends towards power. And sometimes those groups, though certainly not all of them, will say, therefore, it's not possible to gain knowledge. And that's not what I believe. I definitely think there is knowledge. It is possible to figure knowledge out, and protecting sort of the processes, the scientific method, all that is super important. But one of the unnecessary loggerheads that happens in these communities who are talking about this is that these communities will act as if these are contradictory, like act as if you acknowledge that power bends knowledge systems, then you have to be on the side of there's no such thing as objective reality. And those two things can be true at the same time, and we need to acknowledge they're true at the same time to design systems that fully acknowledge the reality of objective truth in many realms, and also fully acknowledge the biases of power and try to say, given those two realities, how do we design systems that will best get at the truth? Now, the next part of the story has to do with knowledge in context. This is the forest versus the trees version of reality. And the scientific method is fantastic at looking at trees. Like if you take something completely out of context and completely control everything about its environment and tweak this one little thing, you can do great experiments. The problem here, though, is that of course, most things happen in context. They happen in relationship to other parts of the system. And if you have to quiet all of the noise that is related to interacting parts of a system to understand one thing, then the body of knowledge will accumulate in a way that is blind to all of the interconnections in the system. And it is important to acknowledge that the forest is an ecosystem where it's not just a collection of trees. Those trees have a relationship with the body of water nearby, the rivers, the birds, the animals, the insects, the chemical environment. There are so many parts of the ecosystem of a forest. And if you just study a tree or like properties of trees, you are going to miss some of the most fundamental truths about the forest. And yet, it's really hard to use the scientific method to study full ecosystems. And of course, I got my start with healthcare economics. And with medical systems, one of the problems we have is that most of our medical treatments are designed and tested in a context where you take the ideal patient, you make sure they adhere to the regimen, and you do not consider the full lifestyle and the way that interacts with any given treatment. And then you deploy it broadly to people who exist in major ecosystems and their body's an ecosystem. And so there's so much of medical knowledge that you can't actually look at, given that the human organism is deeply embedded inside both social systems and interacting biological systems. And of course, one of the problems is that people have many different medical conditions. And if you have 2 or more chronic conditions, there could be interactions between the drugs that you use, interactions between the treatments you use, but we never really gain information about those interactions because there's too many combinations and too many unique circumstances to do controlled trials that look at every possible interaction. So most of the way medicine works in practice is actually quite different from the way it worked in the scientific lab. And we don't yet have enough mechanisms for accounting for the full ecosystem environment of much of our scientific knowledge. And I mean, many fields like social science fields and ecological fields, they have been thinking about this and dealing with this for a long time. But investing more in how do we develop methods or scientific-like methods that deal better with the whole system rather than the isolated part, that's going to be part of what we need to do. The next part of this paradigm shift has to do with salience frames. And salience frames are basically how do we take all of the atomized information, all of the information we encounter, and weave it together into a coherent and usable full worldview. And the way I usually introduce salience is, salience is going to be how heavily something enters into your consciousness or your thinking, how heavily any given fact enters. And the fact is, most real information is going to be not things we're aware of. So the example I use is when my friends who have children, before they were pregnant versus after they got pregnant, how much they notice daycares in their city is completely different. Like before they got pregnant, they didn't notice any daycares. And after they got pregnant, suddenly those daycares became entered into their consciousness. Like they became aware of them. They noticed them when they walked down the street. And it's not that the daycares were invisible or non-existent before. It's just that when the human brain constructs a worldview, it will naturally weigh stuff by its use or its expected use for that person. So of course that's going to create biases that are individual to people. But one of the things I've noticed happening in social media world is that different examples, like different news stories or incidents, will be taken and characterized as if they are common and as if they are increasing. And this will often be done in a way to sort of rile people up and make people feel something, because of course, if people feel something, they're going to pay more attention to it. And social media is competing over attention. But if you take an isolated story or incident and you sort of blow up that incident so it has heavy salience in a person's worldview, that could be wrong. Like it could be false. It could be like you're taking a certain type of person and taking an example of them being violent in some way and kind of blowing that up in a person's worldview such that whenever they see people like that, they'll sort of feel fear or they'll sort of constantly be waiting for that person to go at them or whatnot. If they see someone on a street, they might avoid them or get nervous. And that's a misweighing of information. Even if it's true that that violence did happen, sometimes people in that group are violent. If those stories are sort of blown up in your salience frame, it will lead to these biases in your woven together worldview, even if there is no false information coming in the door. And I think that's just a huge problem that we're going to have to deal with, especially with the way information flows through the digital environment. So the last issue I want to at least mention is this notion of desire or impetus behind communities of knowledge seekers. And the fact that when a community of people becomes really embedded on one side, where they feel almost like threat if the other side of that information battle were to win. At that point, it's no longer possible, in general, I think, for that community to perceive reality. Like anytime there's a piece of reality that might be in favor of the other side, the community sort of, like everything in their heart and brain and body will like look for ways to dismiss it. And this is just like how human beings work. And I think we can look at the environment right now and see there's lots of places where the people are at loggerheads over issues where facts and knowledge and whatnot should be playing into which of these sides is right. And oftentimes it's like 80% one side's right, 20% the other side's right. But even the side that's mostly right, they're not capable of seeing that 20% where they're wrong. And so the question is, how do we design systems that get around that problem? And I think one thing to acknowledge is in many of these situations where groups are at loggerheads, there are people out there that don't follow the debate, don't include that kind of stuff in their social media feed. And so they don't really know the two sides of the argument. And if you could accurately identify the people who have not yet thought about that particular issue, and if you could sort of bring them into a space where one side gets to present their argument, kind of like in a court case where you have the legal defense and the prosecution, both sides get to construct their biased view on their side. If you could have groups of people who took on the judge role, and if you could somehow verify that those groups wouldn't get sucked into one side or another based on affinity to one group or another, I think that's going to be something like the solution. Now, you might have to be intentional about that. You might have to be like, okay, you're in this role where 5 years down the line, you're going to actually look at the two sides of a case of whatever issue is like the hot issue 5 years from now. And to prepare for that role, you are going to have to avoid social media and conversations and whatnot around these topics. Like your social media algorithms will be channeled specifically with your role in mind. And like, would there be people who would be willing to play that role? I think there would be. I think that could be a fun role where you're developing out your critical thinking brain, but not with the controversial topics. Now, that idea needs to be fleshed out, and in some ways it's more of a prototype, not really what it might eventually look like in a system. But in this video, I'm just trying to give you an overview of what I think is needed in this new enlightenment. And the last area of focus for the paradigm shift in information systems is going to relate to digital systems and artificial intelligence and the way information flows through those environments. Like, what does that kind of environment favor? Does it favor more emotional types of information? Does it favor reinforcing existing biases? And these ecosystems of information that are digital, they're fast. They act on communities and cause communities to move quickly in their perception of things. And I don't think we've yet invested enough energy in figuring out what's the best way of using these tools to actually improve people's, not just their fact information, but their Salience worldview information to be functional as a human superorganism. So I think thinking carefully about the way digital tools impact the perception of reality, either toward helpful or toward distorted, that's going to be a key part of the paradigm shift that we need to have happen. Now, there's some other areas, like I have a longer list than these 5 things, but I think these 5 things kind of get us started in thinking about what could this paradigm shift look like?